Hi again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie, and it's very good to be back with you all after a couple week hiatus. As you all may remember, I had my right hip replaced about 2 weeks and a couple days ago, and that has gone well. I'm up and around, actually drove the car for the first time today, and have been able to get out on a social occasion this morning. I'm really only functioning at about 60%, so if I seem a little flat and a little tired, that's because I am. I'm tired from all that procedure. But I'm really glad to be back to the scriptures. I really missed this in the couple weeks that we didn't get to do it. Again, remember, we will not do one on Christmas weekend. Christmas is Saturday, New Year's Saturday. We'll skip both of those, and then we'll just proceed on and finish up when we finish up. This is about Nehemiah and their return from the exile. And I'll give you a little bit of a review, which we covered the last lesson a couple weeks ago, and plunge into it. And the interesting thing is, many people who aren't serious students of this time frame and these group of scriptures don't realize how important the Babylonian exile was. The Babylonian exile allowed the community to evolve from being a Hebrew ethnic, military, and cultural community into a religious community, and it allowed it to see an evolution in its theology and an understanding of the divine and the great mysteries of life. So it was actually, while it was painful for them, it was actually very, very helpful. So I'll give you a little bit of background. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem twice. Conquering Jerusalem is not easy. It's high, it's got water, it's got limestone, you can build it up. In 597 and again in 587, and they took the exiles out. Now the people they wanted in exile were the elite or the upper group of the community. So the royal family, they didn't kill them all, then they took them all as captives, the nobility, the wealthy merchants, the skilled artisans. If you were a skilled silver worker or a gold worker, you got taken off. The landowners, everybody of any value got taken, and only the peasantry was left behind. And they get taken off to Babylon, and Babylon is in the area near Baghdad in modern Iraq. It's all ruins now. I've not been there, and we'll never make it. And in the first 55, 60 years, a lot of good things happened. The community became dominated by the priestly community because all the priests were taken into exile, and they're the most organized of the people in the community. So they get their act together, and they get the first 5 books of the Old Testament together, put together. They took the various historical accounts, the Yahweh account, the Elohim account, blended it with the priestly account, and created the Genesis and story. And then they had an excellent compilation of Moses and the Exodus and the conquest, etc. And even got Deuteronomy together, which is the beginning of the legal structure. So all this, which became Judaism, is put together during the Babylonian exile. A second thing is that there's a massive change in theology. And this is what's called Second Isaiah. We did that a couple weeks ago. If you've forgotten to go back and listen to it again. And Second Isaiah, we don't know who wrote it. It's clearly done during the exile. Isaiah says that, it's not just that Yahweh is our God, which he is, that Yahweh is the only God. And that changes the whole ballgame. Because if this is the only God, then it's not only the God of the Hebrew people, it's the God of the Babylonians and the Persians and the Chinese, which I didn't know about, and all that. It's very, very interesting, and it sets the stage for Christianity, which comes only about 600 years later. But it's crucially important, and it happens during the Babylonian exile. This is the part of Second Isaiah. You have some other prophets, Ezekiel, and several other prophets. They probably put together the Deuteronomic history, or begin to put it together up through Joshua. Deuteronomic history beyond Deuteronomy is Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And 1st and 2nd Kings ends with the Babylonian contest. Here. And they start putting that together. Exactly when it's finished, nobody knows, and it doesn't really make much difference. But that's where they started. So they've actually settled in, and they're doing well in this community in Babylon. And they have enough sense to behave themselves and not take on the authorities. And suddenly in 538 BC, which is about 60 years later, everything changes. Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, who created the great Persian Empire, arrives outside the gates of Babylon. Now, Cyrus was a completely different kind of Middle Eastern conqueror. He realized, and we don't know exactly how he came to this realization or why, that instead of trying to terrorize all your subject populations into being so afraid of you they won't do anything, he thought, why don't I treat them well, treat them decently, show them benevolence and generosity, and they'll be loyal in return. We'll show them loyalty, and they'll give us loyalty in return, rather than we're going to terrorize them and they'll just be afraid of us. Because if you use terror, you have to always have them afraid. Once they're no longer afraid, you're done. The best example was the Berlin Wall came down, and 2 years later the Soviet Union was gone. Because once Eastern Europe wasn't afraid of the Russians anymore, it went poof. And so it appears, nobody knows exactly what happened, that when it comes to the gates of Babylon, there was no fighting. So most likely the locals, who probably hated their own leadership, threw the gates open and let him in, welcomed him with open arms. And he lived up to his reputation. He told all the exile communities, there were several of them. We know what he told to the Hebrew community. You don't want to go back to Jerusalem? Go ahead. You want to stay here? Fine. You want to go back? Fine. It's no problem. And gather up all your religious artifacts, which were stolen from your temple. The gold and the silver and the this and the that. Take it all with you. It's yours. Take it back. Go with my blessing and my protection. Well, this group is going to be extremely loyal to Cyrus because he's treated them decently. Kind of the other analogy is that toward the end of World War II in Europe, the German troops were deserting, fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and running over to the West to surrender to the Americans because they knew we would treat them decently rather than slaughter them like the Russians would do. So, your reputation precedes you, and that kind of reputation is actually very beneficial. So Cyrus comes along, he tells them, go on back. So a group of the community gets together and goes back. It's unclear how many people did, what the time frame was, because the only records about this are the records in the Hebrew Old Testament. So that's it. There's nothing in the Persian records that say I sent these various people back. We just don't know. The account says 40,000 people, which I think is extremely high. Got to remember that Jerusalem's wrecked. They knocked over all the walls. They burned down all the buildings. And so a group led by the priestly community goes back in a year or two. It takes them a long time to walk. You got to walk all the way from Baghdad up and around the Fertile Crescent and back down to Jerusalem. Probably about a 4 or 5 month walk. And they go back and they find the city in ruins. They can identify the outline, the framework of where the temple was from a lot of the footer and the lower part of the walls are still intact, and they identify where the altar was, and they have a ceremony there. And to have a religious ceremony there to celebrate the return from exile. And they begin talking about rebuilding the temple. And they want to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city. And there's a lot of talk. This starts in 538, 537, 536. About 520, a number of years later. See, this thing takes a long time. Then they make a real effort to try to rebuild the temple. The local tribes are referred to in the text as the people of the land. And these are one Hebrew tribe, the Samaritans, who are regarded by this group of Hebrews around Jerusalem as half-breeds, a mixture of the old northern kingdom with some of the exiled communities brought in by the Assyrians when they conquered the northern kingdom in about 720. They're regarded as half-breeds, even though they regard themselves as true followers of the Lord Yahweh. And it's one of the tragedies of the ethnic hostility which is rampant in the Middle East and much of the world now. People hate each other just because of their ethnicity rather than love each other like we're supposed to. And the other groups, the tribes from the Ammonites, which is in northern Jordan up near where Ammon is now, the Edomites, which are down to the south and southeast, and the Moabites, which are across the Jordan. These people don't want to see the Jewish community rebuild Jerusalem and become its own semi-standoffish community before. So they're always going to the emperor and complaining. Finally, about 520, the leaders of the Hebrew community go to the new emperor Darius. There had been two other, Cyrus had only lasted 5 years after the conquest, and he died. The next emperor went insane. That's a bit of a problem when you got an emperor rule, and he was replaced by Darius. And they go to Darius and say, we want to build our temple. And Darius has the other people of the land coming and saying, we don't want them rebuilding their temple or Jerusalem. They're going to be nothing but trouble and blah, 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 blah. So Darius says no. And they go to Darius again and they say, hey, Cyrus promised us that we could rebuild our temple and that he would pay for it. So go back in the archives and see if this is true. So Darius says, okay, and they go back in the archives. By this time, the empires were keeping comprehensive archives. And there it is, a promise, we'll rebuild your temple and I'll pay for it. So they go, oh, and Darius says, okay. Because remember, Cyrus is kind of like a combination of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in the Persian understanding. He was the man. And if he said, I'll do this and I'll pay for it, then they did it. So they get the temple built between 520 down to about 515, and they get it finished. They have a ceremony and blah, blah, blah. And they start to live happily ever after. But what happens is, and this is a religiously based community. The leadership of the community are not the nobility and the princes and all that. The leadership of the community are the priests. And so it's a religiously based community, which is unusual at the time. But it kind of sits there stagnant from 515 BC until 458 BC, which is like 57 years. And nobody knows what was happening because the Persians didn't keep records about them. They didn't keep any of their records. The records we have are what's in the Old Testament. So nobody knows what was going on. They probably were just raising their crops and getting married and living and dying and all that. And it's a relatively small community based in Jerusalem. And so in 458, Ezra appears on the scene. Now, Ezra is a Hebrew who is from the priestly community. Now, remember, the priests claim their succession all the way back to Aaron, Moses' brother. The scribes, which are a different group, claim their succession all the way back to Moses. The priests officiate at the ceremonies. They are the officials in charge, make the decisions, et cetera, et cetera. The scribal community studies the law and the writings, and they say the law says this and the law says that's what's interpretive of what the scriptures, the writings that they have, rather than leading the ceremonies like the priests do. And he's an official in the Persian court. He's kind of like the minister for Jewish affairs. And, if you're familiar with our government now, we have people in Washington that represent the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Guam and our overseas possessions. And it's kind of a similar situation. So he says, I got to go back and try to help them because it's confusion and they're just kind of sitting there and going through the motions. So he goes back and he becomes regarded as the father of Judaism, the person who switched this from the Hebrew community to the Jewish community. One of my friends who's listened to these makes the point, he thinks it's very interesting that I refer to them as Hebrews, which is an ethnic term, rather than Jews, because Judaism doesn't really emerge until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's when Judaism is emerged from this long, difficult history. Now, the one thing that has happened is the 700-year war with the fertility gods is over. Yahweh has won. The fertility gods have disappeared as a major factor. And the little household gods that we talked about several times in the past, they don't find them anymore. The Israeli archaeologists don't find them anymore. So they disappear. So the war with the fertility gods is over. Yahweh won. But this is creating Judaism. And so Ezra has a covenant renewal ceremony. And if you remember the lessons, there have been several of these in the past. Probably the most famous is Joshua 29, where Joshua has conquered the Holy Land and he has a covenant renewal ceremony at Shechem. Most people, including me, think it, in addition to reaffirming the Yahweh faith, to his own people, the Hebrew people. He was offering it to the neighboring tribes. These tribes are all cousins, like the French and the Belgians and the Dutch and the Germans are all cousin tribes with similar language groups. That he was offering the new faith to these tribes also. Some of them took it, some of them don't. So he has a covenant renewal ceremony, and it goes on for 3 days. And he reads from the text. Now, nobody knows what this text is. It's probably from somewhere in the Pentateuch. Now, I don't know if he read out loud the whole 5 books. Did he read the Moses story? Probably. Did he read a bunch of the Leviticus laws? Probably. And some other things like that. But he has this covenant renewal ceremony. It gets on everybody's nerves because it's the rainy season and they have to sit outside the temple while he drones on, et cetera, et cetera. And he is trying to create this as a religious community. And he really does have a significant effect there. But he kind of gets stagnant too. Because he really doesn't seem to be much of an administrator who can take these policies and put them into place. So finally, Nehemiah arrives. Now, Nehemiah is another Hebrew who's working in the Persian government, and he's the cupbearer at the Winter Palace for the emperor. Now, when you read that, people say, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? Let me tell you, being a cupbearer was not only a big deal, it was an enormous deal. Because if you're an emperor of a Middle Eastern kingdom at that time, one of your goals would be to die peaceably in your bed, because you usually get killed by your brother or your sons or your uncles or your generals or something like that. And so the cupbearer has to be a totally trustworthy personality, because an easy way to kill somebody is to poison them by putting poison in their wine. So the cupbearer, so Nehemiah is an extremely trusted part of the Persian government. And that's a very interesting point to make. And the emperor noted, he's heard from people in Jerusalem how bad things are, and he's morose as he's serving them. And the emperor looks at him and says, what's wrong? What are you upset? I'm just paraphrasing this. And he says, well, I'm worried about my people back in Jerusalem, and they can't get their things. And the empress notices also, they can't get their things together, etc. And the emperor basically says, why don't you go back, take care of it. I'll give you my authority over the governor. And he said, I want to rebuild the temple and the walls. He said, fine, take wood from my forest. Because these people were being peaceable. They were supporting the Persians. Persians treated them decently. They responded by being respectful and loyal to the Persians. Loyalty is a two-way street. And so he goes back, and the emperor sends him with a cavalry escort, some other officials. He's a powerful guy. So he comes back, and he sees that Jerusalem is a mess. We don't really know. We don't have any pictures, of course. They didn't have any drawings. They don't have enough photography, of course, for a long time. But it sounds like it's a mess. The walls are pretty much pushed over. The gates were all burned down. A lot of the houses were burned down in the conquest. People are probably living in the ruins. It's a mess. So he says, we got to do something. We just can't let this sit here like this. And the neighboring tribes, the people of the land, they see this guy come back with the emperor's blessing. They get even more nervous, and they're trying to stop him from restoring a Hebrew, i.e. now Jewish, principality here. And so he decides he has to rebuild the walls. But he's got the emperor's authority. He divides this up into family units. Like, if we were doing it, the Guthrie and Senlin family unit would be assigned X amount of this wall space. We have to build it up. Now, we'd need a lot of help because none of us are capable of doing this. But these people all lived, on the land, and so they knew how to do all this stuff. They probably just took the old rocks that had been pushed over, mixed up some mortar, and put them up into a relatively ugly but effective wall. Remember, the purpose of a wall is to slow an attacker down. They didn't have explosives in those days. So if you can slow them down where they're trying to get over the wall, you can kill them as they're trying to come over the wall. So the purpose of the wall is not to be magnificent. It's to slow any attack down and give you time to kill them. And other groups got assigned to build the gates. They had gotten the wood from the emperor's forest. And the gates have to be very well built because they always attack the gates. That's how you get over the easier way than going over the wall is to break the gates down. And the local people of the land get really restive and they start to try to attack them. So it's an interesting description. They took them 52 days to get the walls built. I bet the gates weren't done by that time. I bet the gates took a bit longer. But they had to have guards standing there to keep the Samaritans, the other tribes from attacking and stopping this. And they had to, as they said, have a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other, spear or sword. This was all mano-a-mano combat, you know. Yeah, you did have bows and arrows, but most of it was person on person. So it's this very interesting story, and it gets the walls up, and because he had administrative skill. There's no question that Nehemiah was. I wonder if he's not really the father of Judaism by pulling this off. But you put them together, and he gets the civic structure up and the community organized, and he lets Ezra have another covenant renewal ceremony along the way. Now, one of the interesting things is that they're going to make certain that there's no kind of corruption of the old fertility gods. So you don't have to worry about statues to Baal and idols to the fertility gods. These people are not going to allow it. So the 700-year war is over and won by Yahweh. But the issue here, which is very tricky, is the question of ethnic purity. Now, ethnic purity in the Middle East and even in modern life is a real issue. And Ezra and Nehemiah were shocked, horrified, whatever you want to say, to see all the foreign wives who had been brought in to marry the local Hebrew men, because the mixed race children would learn Aramaic from the mothers. They couldn't speak Hebrew. The women wouldn't speak Hebrew. This was all this great big corruption. And even some of the Hebrew women were married off to the local tribes, the Ammonites and the Edomites. And so they said, no more of this. We have to maintain ethnic purity to keep the community intact. And this is a very interesting thing. It's very harsh. It's very un-Christian. Was it correct at the time? Maybe, because it did breed an enclosed, intact community. And if you're familiar with Judaism, which I'm a little bit, not much, it's a matrilinear society. To be considered Jewish, your mother has to be Jewish. Nobody knows where this comes from. I wonder if it didn't come from here, that your mother had to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish. We just don't really know. And so they instituted this ethnic purity, and they report in the accounts that the men said, oh, that's great, we'll get rid of our foreign wives and children. I suspect it wasn't that easy. I bet it was probably very painful and very difficult, but they did it. The other thing is that a lot of the locals complained to Nehemiah that they couldn't afford to live there. They couldn't make any money. People would have mortgaged their land to be able to have some money for food and crops. They'd have to sell their children into slavery to be able to live and have, again, money for food and crops. And he puts an end to that. He says, none of this. You can't sell your children anymore. You can't mortgage your land. The mortgages are poof. And he puts in a jubilee year. Every 7 years, all your debts are forgiven. So he does this to protect the community. So he sounds like a very skilled administrator. And he ends up, between the two of them, the religious leadership of Ezra, who was the one who could understand the theology, the administrative leadership of Nehemiah, the one who could put it into place. And you end up creating this intact Jewish community now. They have very set religious laws, very set religious customs. Everybody's going to do this. They're all going to be loyal. They're going to have the same ceremonies, et cetera, et cetera. And like most situations, that has great strength. It keeps the community intact. It keeps them aware of what they're supposed to believe in, and blends it together. And it also has problems, because you will eventually, as when Jesus came, find that many of these people are worshiping the law, the rules, rather than the Lord. And this is a challenge for any religion now, even for modern American Protestantism. There's certain groups that really worship the rules. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. Rather than, you got to love everybody. You got to bless those that curse you. You strike you on one cheek, offer them the other. So like many of these situations, this is good and bad, but this is very, very important in understanding the Judaism that Jesus ran into 500 years later when he comes and what he has to deal with. So, yes, they were the fathers of Judaism. They kept the community intact. They allowed the Yahweh faith to be intact until the Messiah came, even though they predicted the Messiah right about this time, and led to where we are now. So it's a very interesting time. It's very easy reading. So you may want to go back and read Ezra and Nehemiah. It's very easy reading. Nehemiah is probably the personal memoirs of Nehemiah, the only time in the Old Testament where you have those intact. So I'm going to stop here. The next lesson is going to be on Psalms. There is no particular reading. When I did Psalms in the in-person class, I would just have everybody bring their favorite Psalms and we would read them, because some people like this and some people like that. Can't really do that. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the best I can, and you all will tolerate me, I'm certain. And then we're proceeding on through this. Like I said, we will not have class on Christmas or New Year's. We'll finish up in mid to late February is my guess. Thank you very much for your time. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie.